Mapagpalayang araw sa ating lahat. Hi sa mga viewers natin dyan. I am Jersky Jarzen Duria of Philippine Statistics Authority, and welcome to my video entitled Reflections on the Epistemological Standpoints Concerning Indigenous Knowledge in the Contemporary World. This paper will focus and offers a reflection on the epistemological perspectives concerning indigenous knowledge, or IK, and in issues that coincide with indigenous cultural preservation in the age of globalization. As a form of reflection, the arguments in this study were derived from several academic articles and contend in paradigmatic analysis from various intellectuals. So here is Mr. Johnny doing some philosophical reflections and contemplations about life, and especially with indigenous knowledge. So this will be the outline of my presentation, which we'll be discussing in the succeeding slides. As an introduction, let us quote Agrawal 1995. But their knowledge certainly cannot be saved in an archive if they themselves disappear. This quotation of Agrawal pertains to the indigenous people, or IPs, and if we will analyze this quotation, we can see here that there are various challenges and struggles which the IPs face and experience, not just in our country, but in the global scale. One of the problems which the IPs face is the loss of land. In the status quo, it is a sad fact that even though there are already agencies in protecting the rights of the IPs, specifically the National Commission in Indigenous People, or NCIP, the problem with the land is still in the context, and we can see it in the study of ADB 2002 and Tauli Corpus 2007, as they stated that the IPs are still categorized as marginalized and are living in difficult circumstances brought by loss of land and access to resources. Aside from the problem with the land, the IPs are also struggling to preserve their indigenous culture because of the defining characteristic of the contemporary world, which is globalization. Using the analysis of Tomlinson 2003, where he states that in the cultural sphere has most generally been viewed in a pessimistic light. That is why their indigenous culture and traditions is in the verge of being forgotten. So we encounter globalization in a variety of ways. However, in the cultural setting, the immense power of globalization and modernity is typically associated with the destruction of cultural identities and culture. Tomlinson 2003. Now that we already categorize or contextualize that the IPs in the present faces various challenges brought by different factors, i.e. globalization and modernity, let us define the various notions regarding indigenous knowledge. So, according to Kalman et al., 2012, IK has been defined in different ways, but it has no universally accepted definition. It has been interchangeably used with other terms such as traditional knowledge, folk knowledge, local knowledge, indigenous practices, and indigenous knowledge systems. So, what we can see here is that IK was not only preserved through written document, but majorly through oral tradition. So, next, now that we already defined IK, let us define and discuss the various notions regarding the impacts of indigenous knowledge. So this table came from Lutpa, where he summarized the debates regarding the impacts of indigenous knowledge. So there are three categories: modernism, indigenism, and the third view, or the debunking the myths. So in the modernism, it looks at IK as detrimental to development and environmental efforts. Also, there is no scientific element which coincide with it. On the other hand, indigenism, where it generally looks at IK as suitable for sustainable attempt, and it has a scientific component. It also has a view that by conserving IK, it will preserve nature and environment at the same time. Lastly, the third view, where it looks at indigenous and the scientific, that these two ideas and concepts cannot be delineated with each other. So by looking at these arguments, we can reflect and ask, does IK really a beneficial to environment? and developmental process, or this just worsen the process? But as the third view suggested, it cannot be delineated with each other. So next, now that the issues and definition of IK has been contextualized, let us now define the various notions regarding globalization, which massively affects IPs, IK, and also the phenomenon which currently shapes the globality. So let us start the discussion with the neutral view of globalization. It is seen that with the advent of globalization, the world is becoming borderless. Also, in the technologically advanced status quo, time and space not constrained for us to be affected by the events happening in the global scale, because we already shared social connection and networks. For example, if a calamity hit a specific country and agricultural sector was devastated in that country, the countries which were depending on raw materials from that country will also be affected. However, let us be reminded that as another view of globalization, it cannot it can be characterized in the form of quote unquote a double-edged sword, meaning it gives positive and negative impacts in our contemporary world. So, for the positive view, globalization integrates market in the global scope, where the flows of information and ideas gives beneficial effect on different countries. However, on the critical view, as Core and Wallerstein stands, it was used by the powerful nation states to exploit the weaker ones in terms of their resources, which can be characterized in the form of quote unquote colonization or neo-colonization. So the challenge now is what edge of the sword should we go on? Or what edge is sharper in today's context? So, in the cultural setting, basically, cultural globalization is in the context. So, in this analysis, it directly implies the negative impacts of globalization, specifically in the cultural perspective, which directly gives an impact to indigenous communities where their distinct cultural identity and cultural practices were challenged and on the edge of being forgotten. With the continuous domination of the global market, economy, and trade, where most of things comes with a price, even indigenous cultures were on the bench of being commoditized and commodified. Now that we already defined the key terms of this paper, the next discussion will be on the issues and challenges of indigenous knowledge in the bench of globalization. So, according to Dove 2006, where he posited that modernity helped to popularize indigeneity and at the same time threaten it. We can see here again the duality of modernity or the globalization. However, as Smith 1999 argues that it contributed various challenges to IPs. One of the challenges which the IPs experience is about their distinct IK because Western knowledge is dismissive on the capacity of IK, which leads to the dichotomy between the indigenous knowledge and the Western knowledge. But let's reminded that the dichotomy between the two has been debated not just in the status quo, but even the earlier anthropologists such as Malinowski, Boas, Levi-Broll, Mose, Evans, Pritchard, Horton, and Levi-Strauss, according to Agrawal 1995. However, what we need to understand here is that the primary aim of IK and the rise of IK in the recent literature is to decolonize research. Going back to the dichotomy between the two concepts, the issue between the two knowledge is that Western knowledge is ignoring, dismissing, and undervaluing the capacity of IK because it focuses on the everyday life of people, while Western knowledge concentrates on the investigative aspect of the world. However, both terms has been in an intimate interaction with each other since the 15th century, so it is difficult to adhere to view of indigenous and western forms of knowledge being untouched by each other. So as an example, Dove 2000 writes, in the case of smallholder rubber cultivation in Southeast Asia, closer study reveals that although this is indeed an impressive system of agroecological knowledge, it could hardly be less indigenous in nature. But what we need to understand is that both concepts have various ways of knowing the world. Let us move on the next issue regarding the rise and fall of IK. So basically, based on these praises, it is evident that the growing developmental researches on IK manifest that it is a vital aspect of development. It also became a platform to give voices to marginalized sectors and communities. But with the growing influence of modernity, IK is in danger because it is not practiced anymore, specifically by younger generations. The newly introduced technologies on livelihood, fishing, and agroforest production might give way for the IPs to forget their culture and traditions. In this sense, the challenge is on us. Should we take another step on helping them to preserve their culture or another step to forget it? So another issue in the contemporary world is about the indigenous knowledge and indigenous cultural preservation of IK. Because IK is slowly vanishing today, and that's the truth. Because of modernity and cultural globalization. That is why there are growing developmental researches and preservation and documentation of IK, or also called as the IKSPs. As Agrawal pointed out, if indigenous knowledge is disappearing, it is primarily because of pressures of modernization and cultural homogenization, which threaten the lifestyles, practices, and cultures of indigenous peoples. However, the open access of knowledge may not be appropriately applied to indigenous knowledge. But the question is, why? If we will analyze, IK is vulnerable to exploitation. So listed here are some of the cases that companies, scientists, and even academicians use IK for their own gain. The problem here is the knowledge which should be benefiting the IPs to improve their economic conditions were used by external people, quote unquote external people, at the expense of the IPs who possess that knowledge. As one example, Posey 1996 claimed that academics and scientists who record IK have enhanced their careers by doing IK research, improving both their status and salaries. Also, the study of Rural Advancement Foundation International 1994 argued that the companies in the agricultural and pharmaceutical sectors have used indigenous knowledge about plants and animals to manufacture new drugs, crop species, and other commercial products, resulting in huge profits. So pharmaceutical, biotechnological companies and researchers are using IK for their self-interest and for their own gain. So next issue is the commodification, bastardization, and commoditization of culture. So according to Greenwood, he analyzed that cultural commoditization is a process where culture is being packaged, priced, and sold like things in a tourism industry, which cause loss of meaning of culture. The immense capitalist agenda and neo-liberalist characteristic of contemporary world, where majority of the population operated by a profit-oriented consciousness. Even culture and IK are frequently misrepresented by majority of the population and were often used as part of innovation and creativity, which tends to be more destructive. So, similar to this observation, is the idea of Burke et al. 2000, where they argued that in the lens of many non-indigenous peoples, they viewed globalization in a detrimental way, where it is a more opening up of new markets and finding new ways of quote-unquote selling indigenous culture. So basically, what we need to understand in this slide and the catch here is it is a sad truth that the scientific researches, which have good motives in the knowledge formulation in the academe, serve and became a threat to the lives and culture of IP communities. Just like what Boisen 2010 observed, the French, Japanese, and American bioprospecting expeditions in the Philippines have resulted in the patenting of ilang-ilang, banaba, nata de coco, and snails at the expense of Filipino IP communities. But it is a good thing that the National Commission on Indigenous People is now in the context to set protocols and guidelines to protect the IPs and their indigenous knowledge. But abuses, and corrupt practices is present in the NCIP, as the employees of the NCIP manipulates the free prior informed consent and collaborating with mining companies for their own gain. So the irony here is that the agency, which is supposed to be protecting the IPs, are the culprits on why they are still oppressed and struggling in our society. Also, by opening IK to everyone, one may misuse the knowledge or irresponsibly exercise the power related to it. So, unlike other knowledge, IK is different because of the ethical and moral issues which coincide within it. This turned out that modernity, mainstream, and popular culture have often misrepresented and abused IPs and indigenous knowledge and practices. So, the question which arises here is that what is our real priority or the government real priority? Environmental conservation and IP rights or economic greed and exploitation? So, we are in the conclusion. I will be using Filipino language to explain this conclusion. So, ano nga ba talaga ang punto ng papel na ito? Makikitang mahalaga ang IK para sa pag-unlad at sa proseso ng sustainable development. Subalit dahil sa duality ng globalizasyon, kung saan nagbibigay ito ng positibo at negatibong epekto, makikitang sa aspeto ng kultura, ito ay nagdudulot ng nakasasamang epekto. Ito ay madalas tignan din sa forma ng westernization and Americanization. Dahil dito, unti-unting nawawala ang identidad ng mga IP at ang kanilang kalinangan, kung kaya't bilang pangkontra sa nangyayaring ito, ang IK ay tumayo at naging prominenteng pag-aaral sa kasalukuyang literatura. Ang mga mananaliksik sa loob at labas ng akademya ay masusing pinag-aralan ang mga IP at kanilang IKSP, sa paniniwalang ang IK ay magdudulot ng positibong epekto sa proseso ng pag-unlad. Subalit ang preserbasyon at dokumentasyon ng mga IK at IKSP sa kontemporaryong panahon ay may mga issue at mga problema dahil ang kultura ay kadalasang ibinibenta, binabastos at nababastos at nilalagyan ng halaga o presyo. Idagdag pa na ang pagiging bukas ng IK ay malimit na naaabuso at nakararanas ng eksploitasyon. Nagagamit din ito ng mga kapitalista para sa kanilang pansariling interes. Dahil dito, bilang refleksyon, di gaya ng ibang kaisipan, ang IK ay iba dahil sa mga ethical at moral na issue na nakapaloob dito. Gayun din, hanggat ang karapatan ng mga katutubo sa kanilang lupa at kultura ay hindi nirerespeto at binibigyang halaga ng nakararami, hindi nga malabong mawala sila sa darating na mga panahon. Bilang huling argumento sa pag-aaral na ito ay nagsisilbing hamon sa ating lahat. Saan tayo tutungo? Maraming salamat.